The presidential house in Philadelphia was a place of grandeur, with its solid walls and large windows that let in little light. There, the silence reigned absolute, interrupted only by the muffled sound of Oney's careful steps as she crossed the corridors, balancing silver trays. Each polished silver reflected the opulence of life in the residence, but also the weight of the bondage that fell on his shoulders. Oney, with his eyes attentive and always open, captured the whispered conversations, the muffled laughs, and the secrets that the powerful tried to hide. Life in the president's house was a constant game of appearances. Every smile of the masters, every kind word, hid the cruel reminder of the power they had on it and the others enslaved. Oney, however, was more than just a servant. There was a fire in it that not even the invisible currents could put out. Her eyes, always alert, had a particular glow, a reflection of something bigger that she was building in silence. As he passed the corridors, Oney remembered his childhood, the days passed in the hot sun, playing before the reality of slavery crushed it. He remembered the stories that his mother told about freedom, about a place where people were not defined by skin color, but by what they brought in their hearts. These stories were their anchors, their comfort in moments of despair. Inside the house, fear was palpable, not only to the enslaved, but also for the masters, who feared the ever-present possibility of a revolt, to lose the control they were making so much. Oney knew that and used it to her advantage. She learned to move like a shadow, to hear what was not to be heard, to plan when everyone thought she only fulfilled orders. Each day, while serving at the presidential table, she watched George Washington and his wife Martha. He saw the way they spoke, how they discussed the country's politics and the future, while deliberately ignored the currents that held so many around them. For them, Oney was invisible, part of the furniture, but for her, every word dictated at the table was a piece in the puzzle she wrote in her mind, a strategy for her own freedom. Oney was not the only one to dream of freedom. There were murmurs among the enslaved, conversations whispered in the shadows of the kitchen and the tight rooms where they slept. She listened to the stories of successful escapes, people who had found their way to places where they could live free. These reports fed their spirit, reinforced their determination of not just another forgotten name in the midst of oppression. In the quiet of the night, when the world around her finally still, Oney allowed himself to dream. She thought of the green hills beyond the city, the rivers that ran away, taking with her the promises of a new life. He imagined himself walking along roads that were not watched over severe eyes, stepping on lands where his name had weight, where his choices imported. Oney was determined. I knew that freedom would not come to her. It would have to be won. Each day in the presidential house was a step in this direction, a silent movement towards the moment he would take to himself what was always his right. The shine in his eyes was the spark of a flame that would one day burn intensely, illuminating his way to freedom. And as you continued to live in their bubble of power and privilege, Oney fed her dream, a secret under construction, waiting for the right time to break free and never look back. Oney couldn't sleep. The nights were endless, with the dark room's darkness surrounding her like a heavy cloak. But it was there, in that silence, that the air filled with the constant buzz, that she found time and clarity to think. While the rest of the presidential house dived in sleep, Oney kept his ears attentive. From time to time, the sound of steps on the floorboards or a sigh from the other rooms broke the silence. It was in these moments of vigil that she allowed herself to dream of the impossible. Once, while helping in the kitchen, a sailor passing through the city approached her. He had tired eyes, but a frank smile that inspired confidence. Between a sip and another of rum, he began talking about distant places, where the air was lighter and the sun shone with another intensity. He mentioned New Hampshire, his eyes shining with the memory of land where freedom was not just a word, but a reality. There, no one runs after you because of the color of your skin, he said, his low voice almost a whisper, not to get attention from you. Those words were like seeds planted in Oney's heart. For days, she watched them with her hopes, feeding on the idea of a place where she could walk without fear. The name would no longer be chained to the will of others. Oney knew it was dangerous to dream. Hope, if discovered, could be used against it, just as a whip or a chain. But in that muffled room, as the world slept, it allowed her mind to place for those distant lands. She began to set up a plan, a puzzle that required patience and accuracy. He could not hurry. He could not make mistakes, for a false step could cost him not only freedom, but life. Oney studied every detail of the house, memorized schedules, routines, and especially the distractions he could use to his advantage. She watched the guards, the times when they changed the shift, the moments of carelessness that happened when they believed that everything was under control. Oney knew it would need help. I couldn't do that alone. Slowly, he began to form a network of trust among the other enslaved. People who, like her, dreamed of seeing the sunrise in free land. There was Betsy, the cook, who had heard of a safe route to the north, and Sam, the young man who took care of the horses and knew well the ways that led out of town without drawing attention. Carefully, Oney shared her intentions with them, gaining allies to her cause. Each conversation was a risk, but also a flame that kept the hope that freedom was not just a distant dream. They planned in whispers, exchanged significant looks during the day, and at night, when the house dived into silence, shared ideas and hopes. The confidence between them was the key, an invisible current that united them in search of the same goal. Oney knew I would need one last detail, the right moment, an opportunity to disappear without traces, an event that kept the eyes of you distracted enough for your absence to go unnoticed until it was too late. As he planned, his heart was hitting the chest, driven by adrenaline and the desire for freedom. That night, while lying in the old wooden bed, Oney decided that she would never die in captivity. She squeezed her eyes, imagining the flavor of the outdoor, the sound of the wind between the leaves, the feeling of her feet touching the earth that belonged to no one. It was a vivid dream, so real that I could almost touch it. And it was in that stillness, in the darkness of the muffled room, that Oney found the courage necessary to turn his plan into action. She didn't know how or when, but she was sure she would soon leave that house behind and never look back. The night was especially dark when Oney finally took the courage to take the most important step in her life. The sky above was without stars, a black blanket that seemed to keep its secrets and plans. The cold of dawn cut the air, but his heart was hot with the determination that moved it. The simple dress he dressed was his only protection against the cold wind, but the faith he carried was enough to warm his soul. Everything was silent in the presidential house, except for the distant sound of the guards exchanging shift. Oney took advantage of this moment of distraction. She slid down the shadows like a shadow herself, every step calculated so as not to make noise, each movement an act of courage. The way to freedom was full of uncertainties, but it had spent countless nights planning every detail, every escape route, every eventuality. She knew she couldn't look back. The stories he had heard about enslaved and brought back, severe punishment and public humiliation, all fed his fear, but also his courage. The idea of being free was any risk. Oney moved rapidly, passing through the gates of property with a skill that only a life of observation and patience could teach. Outside, the city of Philadelphia slept in peace, oblivious to the drama that unfolded on its streets. Oney knew he needed to mix with the few passers-by still circulating there. She pulled the hood of the dress over her head, hiding her face, and walked with firm steps, as if she had a right destination. The strategy was to seem safe, as if it were just another person coming home after a long day at work. The guards would soon notice their absence, but Oney counted on it. He knew the search would start at the house. It would take time until they realized that she was no longer there. This was the time she needed to distance herself enough to reach the meeting point combined with Sam. Sam was there, just as she expected. He had gotten a horse, a strong, agile animal, ready to take it as far as possible. "Go north," he whispered as he helped Oney ride. "Follow Rio when you can. Don't stop until you get to New Hampshire." Oney nodded, his eyes meets giving his in a moment of silent gratitude. There weren't enough words to express what they felt, but they both knew they were fighting for the same cause, freedom. As he rode into the unknown, Oney's heart pounded, no longer with fear, but with hope. The city was soon behind, and the sound of the horse's hooves on the ground was the only music he needed to hear. With each kilometer covered, she felt the invisible chains that bound her break one by one. The feeling was indescribable. News of the escape spread quickly. The city woke up in an uproar, whispers about the enslaved woman who had defied George Washington himself filling the mouths of onlookers. Oney's name began to become something of an urban legend, a symbol of resistance and courage. For those still living under the yoke of slavery, she was an inspiration, proof that freedom was possible, even in the face of overwhelming power. The guards searched for her for days, but Oney was like a ghost, always one step ahead, always out of reach. She wouldn't go back, not as long as there was air in her lungs and strength in her legs. With each dawn, she got closer to the north, to a future where she could be her own man. In the darkness of the night and the silence of the forests she crossed, Oney felt the presence of all those who had dreamed of freedom before her. They were his strength, his guide on the journey. And as the wind whispered through the trees, she knew she would never be alone. The road to freedom was long and arduous, but at that moment, Oney was closer than he had ever been. She had become the invisible woman who dared to challenge the most powerful man in America, and, in doing so, paved the way for many others who would come after her. The news of Oney's escape reached George Washington like thunder on a stormy night. The president, accustomed to control and order, could not believe that a simple slave would challenge his authority in such a way. There was something personal about this affront, a feeling that his power had been mocked. His wounded pride did not allow him to ignore what happened. Orders were quickly distributed, and a manhunt began. Bush captains and guards were called in. Each promised generous rewards for Oney's capture. But the task would not be easy. Oney, now free, was like the wind, impossible to capture, fickle and always in motion. Every day that passed without her recapture was a victory for her, a defeat for Washington. The president, frustrated, increased the pressure on his men, insisting that they look for it in every corner, in every city, on every road that led to the north. Meanwhile, Oney moved with the sagacity of someone who has learned to survive in silence. She knew she couldn't trust anyone but herself and the few allies she had made along the way. Her strategy was simple but effective. She changed her name in each new place she passed, assumed different roles and dresses, becoming practically invisible to the eyes of her pursuers. Once it was Mary, a cook in a small inn. In another, it was Anne, a seamstress in a quiet little town. Each disguise was a new identity, a new layer of protection. The network of abolitionists, those who believed in a world free from chains, became vital to its success. They were ordinary people, but with extraordinary courage, willing to risk everything to help a woman who refused to be property. They passed coded messages, provided shelter and guidance, ensuring that Oney was always one step ahead of his hunters. Each house that sheltered her was a sanctuary, each family a new hope for a different world. The search circle closed, but Oney continued forward with the determination of someone who knows there is no turning back. She crossed rivers and forests, facing fatigue and hunger, but the vision of freedom was a beacon that guided her through the darkest nights. There were times when fear almost paralyzed her, especially when she heard the sound of horses in the distance or saw shadows moving in the forest. In those moments, she remembered her mother's stories, the whispered words about courage and resilience. On one such night, while resting in an abandoned cabin, Oney had a rare moment of peace. Sitting by the unlit fireplace, she closed her eyes and imagined the future she longed for, a future where she could walk without chains, where her children would not know slavery, and where her past would no longer define her. The dream was almost palpable, and she clung to it with all her might. The hunt continued, but each day that passed without his capture was a new victory for Oney. The president's determination clashed with the unwavering will of a woman who refused to be forgotten as a mere pump. And although the search was relentless, the truth was that Oney had already won. She had won something that no man, however powerful, could take: the freedom of her soul. The story of his escape spread, not only as a legend of bravery, but as a symbol of hope for all those who still lived in captivity. Oney, the woman who became the wind, was now an inspiration, a reminder that freedom, no matter how far she was, is always worth pursued. And while Washington's men continued to search, somewhere to the north, Oney advanced, a step closer to a destination she had chosen herself. In New Hampshire, Oney found a place that welcomed her as the wind welcomes the fallen leaves. It was a different land, with a cold that cut the skin but could not reach the flame that burned inside it. There, she was a new woman, without visible chains, but still marked by the invisible scars of slavery. Freedom had a bittersweet taste, sweet for autonomy, bitter for the constant shadow of the persecution that followed her right there. Oney knew he couldn't simply disappear, that the world would not forget a woman so easily that he challenged George Washington himself. Still, she refused to live in fear. In New Hampshire, she reinvented herself, bringing with her only the memories and dreams that had guided her there. Each day was a victory, every dawn a promise of a future she was building herself. She found work on a small tailoring, where her agile and careful hands were more valued than her story. Oney sewed pieces accurately, but also with hope, intertwining at each point the freedom that was now part of his life. The people around her saw her like a silent but dedicated woman, someone who carried a world of wisdom in her eyes, but who spoke little about her past. There was a church in the city, a simple but welcoming construction where Oney found comfort. There, she prayed in silence, thanking for the days that added to her freedom. In that sacred space, she allowed herself to dream of a world where everyone could be free, a world she would like to help build, even silently. The pastor's sermons were like balms to his tired soul, reminding her that, as hard as battles, faith and determination could move mountains. Over the years, Oney has built a new family. He found love in a man who looked at her without judgments, who saw in her more than a fugitive, but a companion of life. James was a simple, hard-working, and kind man who understood the value of freedom as well as she. Together, they formed a home, a space where the walls were made of love and respect, not bricks and chains. Oney had children, and each of them was a reminder of the future she fought to conquer. She created them with the certainty that they would never know the currents that once arrested her. I told them stories about courage and resilience, about the importance of fighting for what is right, even when the world seems to be against you. His children were free, and that was all that mattered. But the shadow of slavery never left it completely. There were nights when Oney woke up startled with her heart, as if the echoes of the past still chased her. Sometimes he spotted family faces in the crowd, and fear came back, the fear that someone would recognize her and try to take her back to a life she had left behind. Even so, Oney never regretted her choice. In New Hampshire, she lived every day with the certainty that she had done what was right. Freedom was a precious gift, a right it had fought hard. And although he lived in shadows, always warns, the life he chose was hers and no one else. Oney knew that his story was not only yours, but of all those who still dreamed of freedom. His life in shadows was a life of silent resistance, a testimony of the willpower and the desire to be free. And while time passed, Oney became not only a woman who had escaped, but a symbol of hope for all those who still lived under the yoke of slavery. Oney lived her days with dignity and never looked back with regret. In his heart, he carried the flame of freedom, a flame that would never go out. And so, the woman who had once challenged the most powerful man in America continued to live in peace with her choice, knowing that her life, however discreet, was a victory. Oney died free. His hands, once heated by forced labor, rested quietly, without the ties of slavery. She left this world as he always dreamed, in peace, owner of herself. No current, no decree, no powerful name managed to erase it. Your story, woven with color, they act and determine, it was passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, like a bonfire that never goes out. In the years that followed his escape, the memory of Oney lived silent but powerful. His life became a symbol of resistance, a spark of hope for those who still lived under the weight of the chains. And it was through the stories told by his children and grandchildren that his legacy was perpetuated. Every word, every memory, was a reminder that freedom is not granted, it is conquered. In his small home in New Hampshire, the walls kept more than just family stories. There, hanging in a corner of the room, there was a map. It wasn't just a piece of paper with lines and routes. It was the map that Oney had used to plan his escape, a memory of his courage and the path he tried in search of his freedom. Her children grew up listening to that dark night, about the silent steps that took her away, about the horse that awaited her, and the friend who helped her escape. Oney challenged the supreme power of his day. He faced the most powerful man in the country and, against all probabilities, won. His victory was not just a personal, it was a collective victory, a victory for all those who believed that freedom was an inalienable right. And every step that took that night turned into an echo that resonated for centuries. Over time, the story of Oney intertwined with the history of the country. Their actions inspired others to fight, not passively accepted their fate. She showed that even in the face of the most cruel oppression, it is possible to resist. And although many still unaware of their name, their spirit was present in every act of resistance. In addition to the family, the local community was also involved in preserving Oney's memory. The people who met her shared her stories, keeping the flame of her courage alive. In church encounters, at family meetings, in conversations around the fire, Oney was mentioned with respect and admiration. His name has become a symbol of strength, an inspiration to continue fighting for a fairer world. Years after his death, when slavery was finally abolished, many remembered Oney. She was one of many who paved the way for that moment, one of the first to show that freedom was possible. And although he was no longer alive to see the change, his legacy continued to influence generations. Oney's descendants grew up with the certainty that they were heirs to a story of courage. They have learned to value freedom, to fight for their rights and never give up their dreams. In schools, teachers began to tell Oney's story, not just as a fugitive, but as a heroine that challenged the status quo and won. Oney died free, but his soul never rested. She continued to live in the daily struggles of each person who refused to accept injustice, of every voice that rose against oppression. His escape has become a silent symbol of courage, proof that even when the world tries to shut up, one step toward freedom can echo for centuries. And so the woman who challenged the supreme power of her time became eternal. Oney left a legacy of freedom and courage, a legacy that will never be forgotten. She was more than a woman who escaped the chains. She was the personification of a dream, the dream of freedom for all. And this dream continues to inspire, moving mountains and illuminating the way to future generations.